Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. There are probably still just a few more people to join us, but let us make a start. Before we do, as you will probably know, last Friday, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, passed away. And we are now in a period of national mourning. We did consider very carefully whether this event should continue to take place, and we felt that it should. Many of Prince Philip's remarkable achievements were related to education, not least the Duke of Edinburgh Awards scheme. This evening is an educational event. In listening to the tributes paid by the members of the royal family to Prince Philip, in keeping with his character, and learning of his wishes for his funeral, for example, it seems most likely that if he had been asked, he would have wanted us to just get on with it. And so that is what we do. But in so doing, we pay tribute to his long life and remarkable service to this nation and his support for Her Majesty the Queen. And we remember him with sincere affection. May he rest in peace. And so to this evening, and may I welcome you all. We will do introductions in just a little while, but first the house rules for this evening. The event is being recorded. You are welcome to keep your cameras on, and it would be nice if you felt able to do that. But if you could remain muted until we get to the question and discussion part of the evening, that would be appreciated. We hope that you will engage this evening, and it would be most helpful if you could put your questions in the chat function. And if you put them in a way that we can all read, then our speakers will have prior notice. This evening is quite a special one for the company. It is the first occasion that we have had to celebrate our partnership with Leeds Beckett University. And we welcome Jeff and Nick as representatives of Leeds this evening. Now, this is going to be a two-way partnership. Not only will the company support and encourage students and will work with the university, but also the university is going to work with us. And this evening is evidence of this. And I'd also like to name check at this point Liveryman Alan Wood, who is our principal point of contact with Leeds. The subject this evening. Our subject is Futures and Foresight, essential context for recovering from COVID, managing risk, and safeguarding the improvements of organisation. Why have we chosen it? Well, it's of interest to all of us. As Mark Twain said, "The future interests me. I'm going to spend the rest of my life there." It's a subject which is relevant to our company in several ways. It's significant for boards. They're responsible for the health of the company, and unless they look ahead in a sensitive and meaningful way, that's going to be somewhat more difficult to do. It is also significant for our students because of the change in syllabus and the introduction of board dynamics. What I'm going to do now is to introduce Dr. Nick Beach, Director of Executive Learning at Leeds Beckett University. He's going to say a few words and will then introduce Professor Jeff Gold. Nick, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Just to confirm, my name is Nick Beach. I am the director of the MSc Corporate Governance. So I run the CGI's program, the integrated CGI program. I run a number of other programs relating to executive development and contribute to the MBA and other programs. Really today, for me, I just want to share with you what we have tried to bring forward with regards to futures, both within the university curriculum, but also some themes that we've identified within the boardroom, particularly on the board dynamics module. Initially, we started off by linking futures and foresight with leadership self and creating the future module, which is a module we run with on a master's award for the military. And what we did was we didn't just pop it into a module, but we had it as a pervasive theme that went through the program. So futures was something that was an iterative process and started to get the students to engage on both practice of thinking outside the box and the practice of doing something about it. So we found that it had an effect of empowering people. So that was one of the major things that we found with the level 7 masters module. With that in mind, we also moved it on to a level 5 program, that's second year degree. And we linked it to basically management tools and management thinking, but also for sustainable development. And it was quite interesting, as most undergraduates sort of don't think much more than the next day. And to get them to start to focus into 10 years, started to change their mindset. What was really interesting was that they were starting to think about their job career selections, not just for something to think about in level 6, but to actually start engaging with it now. So it started to move them forward, and they started to see consequence for actions. So sustainable development wasn't just something, oh, all the polar bears are going to die. It was then engaged with, well, if I'm going to do something about it, I now need to do something about it now. And what was significant for me with this level 5 module was it started to change the mindset of those people at the lower ends of the educational process. And it may well be indicative that this could be something that is useful to go throughout an organization, and you move past that concept of don't step over the milk. It starts to have people feel that they have more responsibility for their actions. And it was something that we got a lot of very positive feedback from the students. Finally, we've introduced futures within the board dynamics module. And I just want to share some themes with regards to that. It started to raise issues with regards to the board and how the board conversations were, and expose complexities and also the nature that boards needed to think of the interdependent and co-creation elements within board conversations, and also to understand that change is a dynamic process, and you can never really predict the future, but what you need to do with futures is to look for plausible futures, which will make you more resilient and agile. So that was an interesting theme that started to come through. And what was particularly significant was that futures helped the quality of thinking in the conversations. And as such, you had enriched conversations and people started to ask more informed questions. So there was a mindset change with regards to futures. When people start to look at time horizons, they start to be more aware of what's going on in their world. Why? Because we start to raise their attention to start looking at things that should be considered. And because of that, we started to find that we could encourage this, the obligation of a constructive dissent within the board. And literally what we were talking about was changing the quality of the conversation that's in the room, and how the company secretary, in a sense, can act as a facilitator to improve the conversations, because they can raise the future as having consequence. And really the bottom line was the important element there, the importance of now, and that governance of consequence is important. In other words, the decisions the boards are making at this moment in time will have an effect in 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years. And for the senior directors to take things on board. What was interesting was in the company secretaries dealing with more medium-sized companies, this was quite a new experience for them, and that idea of consequence, whereas someone who'd say working in the NHS, they had a better understanding of this, how they had to change the conversation within the room. And these were quite powerful moves. But Futures as a tool helped to change mental models, gave a better appreciation of systems thinking to the game. So, and that really enriched the module, and the conversations were much more lively and much more critical in the way they approach things. So that's one of the reasons why we've introduced Futures into the curriculum, and we're finding it works particularly well at 7 because the people are becoming more strategic, but it's also working at the lower levels because people are starting to take on responsibility for themselves and their own personal development. So those were the key features on the regards to Futures. I'm going to close down now and pass over to Jeff, but Jeff is our Professor of Organisation Learning. He's an extremely well-published professor, has a major core text in HRM. He has published in academic journals in diversity, leadership development, storytelling and futures, so that it has a diverse role. But one of his key themes is the applied nature of learning. In other words, it's not practice, it's praxis. It's doing it and putting it into action. And Futures, I think, is one of these tools that can enable that to occur. And at that point, I will now shut up and pass on to Jeff.
Thank you for shutting up, Nick. Well done. So, good evening, everyone. And hopefully, let's see how this moves, make sure it happens. Okay. So, to get you thinking about the future, I'm going to ask you to just complete a couple of questions or a couple of exercises to make you think in a particular way. So at the moment in your organization, can you score yourself on your current planning horizon? Do you plan for less than 2 weeks? I know organizations that can't think more than 2 weeks ahead at the moment. Or can you plan for 1 month or up to 6 months' time? And maybe you're in an organization that can plan for 1 year or even 3 years. I mean, 3 years is how many organizations thought they used to be able to plan. But interestingly, are we ever going to get back to that position? They were struggling to do that, I must say, even before the pandemic. So the pandemic has accentuated the difficulties in planning for more than 3 years or more. So that's the first exercise I'd like you to just think about. The second exercise is this one, which you may have done before. It's called Consult the Oracle. It's based on the particular attribute of Pythia, who in Greek mythology was the priestess to Apollo at Delphi. And her particular attribute, her capability, was if you could ask her a question with a yes or no answer, she could give you the answer. Well, I'm not so much interested in what the answer is at the moment. I'm interested in the question that you pose. So why don't you just write down 1 or 2 questions about the future of your business or your organization for the year 2026. Now, I'm using 2026, which is only 5 years ahead, because for the last year, that is sufficiently challenging. Usually, prior to that, my exercises were 10 years ahead. But crucially, at the moment, that would be less useful than 5 years ahead. So why don't you just write down the question, or write down 2 questions, because if you write down 2 questions, which are different to each other, that gives you 2 possibilities. And I'll give you a little bit of incentive here. On one of the occasions when I made this presentation, I think 3 months ago, I got a message that the exercise and what we did with the exercise saved the business. Now, you know, I haven't got much more evidence than that. Then she told me that the exercise that I put her through saved the business, and it was no more than what you've just done. Okay, so let me just move on, and please feel free to ask questions by filling in the chat. If you write your questions as I talk into the chat, we will be able to answer or talk about them at the end of the presentation. I hope to talk for no more than 30 minutes. So what is Fruition and Foresight if you haven't come across it before? Well, this is one definition that we use. It's based on the work of a guy called Pero Mičić. Pero was one of my PhD students. I've supervised 3 PhDs in futures because I don't come from a futures background. I come from an HRM, HRD, leadership and management development background. But I was involved in the supervision of 3 PhDs in the late 90s, brought into the game by a chap called Graham May, who was running at the time a Futures and Foresight Masters, but he wasn't a business academic. And he brought me in to help supervise someone who actually, interestingly at the time, doing his PhD, the candidate was aged 69. The result of his PhD was to work out a system of life to the age of 120. And he's still living. So interestingly. So this particular definition that Pero developed, as you can see, it is about predictable, yes, I'll explain that in a moment, but more likely possible and plausible long-term futures. That was his definition, which we use. We've added predictability into the definition for a particular reason. And I always put this as a warning sign at the start from a couple of futurists in the 90s. It's not for wimps. It actually is quite challenging and can be quite scary for people. Okay, so what do I want to cover? Well, I'm going to argue that it's important as we believe we might be emerging from the COVID-19 era. I'm not sure yet. It's possible. I think what I want to show you, importantly, how leaders and managers can learn future skills. As Nick has already said, we are already trying to bring this to the curriculum for undergraduates and postgraduates. And I will show you how futures links to strategy and its implementation in a very productive way. And I'll use that with some case material that I've been building up over time. Already this week, I've run 2 futures sessions with organizations. So the data's coming in all the time. Okay, I call this Futures and Foresight Learning, FFL. I've been trying to influence the learning and development community, which is my community, that Foresight belongs in that community as well. To that end, I've got a book coming out in May, which you'll find on Amazon, which includes Futures and Foresight as part of what we call the learning-driven business. What I'm showing you here is that the Futures and Foresight can exist along a dimension. The left-hand side is the predictive approach to futures. Well, 7 or 8 years ago, we might not have been concerned with prediction, but we are now. Why? Because we have embraced that predictive analytics enables us to predict probable futures. I was involved in a significant project with West Yorkshire Police on the introduction of predictive analytics to consider crime in Bradford, for example. And what was developed was an algorithm that provided prediction of where crime might occur. But as you move from left to right, you embrace the idea that as you look into the future, there isn't just one possibility, there are a range of possibilities. And then we can start to use that notion to be creative about the future. We can talk about opportunities and creating new ideas, creating new services, new products, but also as a risk aversion approach by embracing what is undesirable in the form of surprises and counterfactuals. I currently have a group in Nigeria that are considering surprises, and I'll show you some of the data that's emerging from their organization. They have another review with me on Friday. So there's a whole range of approaches to futures and foresight, and the way I do it, it means that there's enough to occupy people for 3 years if they need it. I learned most of this by applying it with one of my clients located not too far away from where I live in Ilkley, a large organization. I won't tell you who they are, but you might guess if you know the geography. When I was at Leeds Beckett full-time, I'm now, because I retired, but I'm now there a day a week. And what I used to do on the MBA was use this diagram to explain to people on an MBA where futures and foresight might live. And it kind of suggested that for 3 or 4 years, you might work with a forecast, uncertainty and predictability change over time. So after 3 and 4 years, up to 10 to 15 years, you might work with futures and foresight, but as uncertainty increases way beyond 15 years and predictability falls, after 15 years, you live in hope. Well, of course, that has changed. So what we now find, or what I found even before COVID, we found that predictability fell away faster. So I was working with organizations where I always suggested you need a 3-year strategy. What began to happen is we needed to have a 2-year strategy that rolled along over time. So crucially, futures and foresight started to move towards the left axis. And that meant for me reducing the time period to 2026 rather than 2031. But you can certainly find futures in some industries like oil and gas, for example. The Shell scenarios talk about 50 years, for example. I've used the word scenarios there because often people understand futures and foresight as scenarios. I want to make it very clear. Scenarios is one of the tools of futures and foresight that most people are familiar with, but it is certainly not the only tool and not even the major tool. What do I think about why futures and foresight is so important for leaders? Well, I have always argued that leaders and boards must provide clarity about the direction of their organizations. And to that extent, they must be strategic thinkers. So this for me is always the first principle of leadership. Provide clarity for the direction of the organization. Because if you as leaders do not know where you're seeking to take the organization, how can you explain it to others? So you need the skill to do that. But as I say, even before COVID, the direction of the organization was constrained by changes in the world which were unpredictable, summarized usually as VUCA. So this creates a degree of tension between what you are required to do and how you do it. And for me, that opens the gap for futures and foresight. Let me introduce you to a guy in the US who was one of my PhD students, Andy Heinz. Andy Heinz came to me. He was a consultant in the US, in Houston, had the wonderful website, which you can still get to, called Andy Heinz site. Good name for a futurist, I think. I usually get laughter, but of course you've got the mics turned off, so I won't hear the laughter. Andy had a great deal of experience working in organizations in the US, often large organizations. And what he found was he would run workshops on futures. I've brought him over to the UK and I've seen the workshop he runs, and it's really good and insightful. But what he struggled with was that organizations did not integrate what they were learning into their ongoing strategic learning. He would do the workshop and then he would leave, and they would not call him back, or they wouldn't call him back to help integrate what they did into their strategic learning. So this became the topic of his PhD. It became the research question, and the outcome of that was a PhD. So he is now Dr. Andy Heinz at Houston University. But crucially, as you can see, and we wrote a paper together based on his PhD, and this set out how you could integrate foresight into organizations. You can get a copy of this paper on our Futures and Foresight website, which appeared on the first slide. You can download it and you'll be able to read an academic paper on how we did that. So I made use of that. This is what I like to do. I said, okay, Andy, here's a theoretical presentation of what you think we can do to integrate futures and foresight. You know what? I'm going to do it. So I set this up in one of my clients, a financial services organization, a large financial services organization, not too far away. Its headquarters is not too far away from Ilkley. So you can guess who they are. So what I did, I've had a long relationship with this organization, mainly through doctorate students who work in this organization. And I was talking to one of the leaders, and he came up with an issue, and I said, okay, I think I've got a new idea for you. And he became my insider. So the paper I just talked about said you start by finding someone on the inside of an organization who is interested, and you persuade them that futures and foresight could work for you. So what he then did, and what I persuaded him to do, is we found others from the talent pool. These were leaders who weren't in the executive team, but could be just below the level of the executive team. But in fact, you can use futures with all sorts of people. But what we did is we formed an action learning set. Now, I won't explain action learning, but I am just as well known for action learning as I am for anything else. And what we did in 2017, because as you can see, we were using a 10-year horizon, we set up a focus. I worked with the group, and what we did is we engaged in this learning process over a period of time where they would meet every 4 to 5 weeks for 90 minutes or so, and each time we moved the process on. Now, to cut the long story short, what I was able to do in that period of time was I was able to take them through the various methods that are available for this first rung of futures and foresight. And remember, we were still in an introductory phase, and this is what most people go through before they move on to more challenging material. But they started with questions that you've done, and then they would do what's called in Future and Foresight horizon scanning. This is where they become used to searching the literature in the search for patterns and trends. Interestingly, I did a review on yesterday with a group of architects who are one of my clients at the moment, one of the large firms of architects, and I've got 9 in the group. And what was so interesting, they were astounded by the literature that they could find, because for the first time in their lives, for most of them, they learned how to use Scholar Google. If you haven't used Scholar Google before, go away tonight and try it out. And they found all sorts of material to help them understand trends and patterns. And what's important about that process, they've already got actions to take. So again, because it's an action learning process, each time there's action to take, and you can exert influence on the strategy almost straight away. So they learned how to do projections. They learned how to do mini scenarios. This is an example of a mini scenario that they developed, 2027. I think most of it's come true and been enhanced, accentuated by the pandemic. They then had to critique their assumptions, test their assumptions, and in the next 2 years after 2017, we moved towards surprises, counterfactual futures, and provocative futures. And each time they were able to apply their learning very quickly, and each time, in certain cases, new products and services were surfaced. So crucially, what we found here was a great deal of learning was going on, and I started to chart the learning. Again, I'm not going to read these out, but crucially, what you can see, the kind of words people are using. And let me just move to this one, because again, this is what started to happen. Again, they saw the development of internal capability. And I think this is one of the most striking features in this organization. And before the pandemic, they improved their performance year by year. And they attributed this performance improvement from top to bottom in terms of the strategy, what they saw as alignment. And it was the futures and foresight process connected to strategy which created that alignment. And what they could see was they were making projections, but from that they could use a process I call reverse extrapolation. And from that, we were able to see implications, and we could see the outcomes appearing. What began to happen after a year and a half, we began to put futures and foresight into leadership programs. And we did that progressively. At the time I finished working with them in March of last year, when the pandemic came, we had done 5 cohorts of 15 leaders, and each cohort had a futures and foresight module as part of their leadership program. And that meant we were finding more of the leaders in the business were able to use the tools of futures and foresight. And more importantly as well, we were able to move to surprises and counterfactuals. At the last session I did on counterfactuals, I asked them to express an unthinkable for 10 years' time, and they managed to come up that one of the counterfactuals was that their chief exec would no longer be a human being in 10 years' time. We didn't tell the chief exec that this was going to happen, but interesting all the same. So what I could see was the way by which businesses could make use of it. This is an example of what appeared in March last year, and this is when, at a time when this organization was faced with an increasing number of its interactions with customers was through digital-based medium and channels. And so what they had to work out, now in this organization, they had a particular value set, which was that they valued the human touch and the human contact. But what they could see was that increasingly more and more of their customer interactions was beginning to come through a different channel other than human beings. So what's important about this is they use this process to redevelop their strategy for the digital time that they were entering. And this has continued to current times. This one we did during sort of, let me think, about April, May, June of last year within the university, when we were trying to help staff consider the next 5 years after the pandemic. And this group considered collaboration as being a key to enhance teaching and learning. And we're setting about doing this in the university. So this was produced by a group of academics. This one is this is fascinating. This is a real estate business in Nigeria. Just outside the capital Abuja, there is a housing estate that has been developed by a man called Dr. Ogun. Adrian Ogun earned millions of pounds by being Lennox Lewis's boxing manager. And he's a British Nigerian. He went back to Nigeria and he is building 500 houses, but they are learning futures. And one of their approaches they're up to is to look at surprises. I think it's remarkable how some of these surprises are beginning to take shape. And again, what they're doing now, as you can see, this is again from the same organization. These are looking at key questions about foreign materials. Particular foreign materials are used in the construction of what they regard as high quality housing. But anyway, these are just examples of where futures can go. Let me just move to a conclusion now. How do you integrate this? How do you integrate your futures to strategy? Okay, well, we developed this model of strategy in response to finding a way of fitting futures to make sure that futures connected to strategy. So the label futures there is basically the futures group. But what you can see in this approach to strategy is it begins initially with the consideration of past data. Let's say a SWOT analysis of some kind. I have added more recently the notion of a strategic foresight lab aimed specifically at leader teams. I think they need to do this as they enter a period post-pandemic. And that means that futures can be integrated right from the start into a leadership team. But crucially, what we did was we did two things. We said, okay, let's develop the strategic plan and let us support the leadership plan, the strategic plan, with a strategic thinking capability. So this was one level below the leadership team, one level below. And that person with his team was able to work with me as his expert support. And importantly, he was also in the futures group. So what he was able to do were three things really. One, incorporate futures and foresight into his strategic thinking. And through his interaction with the leadership team, he could then feed back the findings. What he was also able to do was to pay attention to the emergence of what was appearing in the world at the time. And remember, we were doing this in 2017. So actually, this has continued. And what we did at that time, we said every 3 months we will meet to review the strategy. Well, what I do now in organizations that apply this model, I insist that we review the strategy every 6 weeks. So crucially, I get my clients to set a 2-year strategy, even if they can see that it is difficult to do that. It's important to set direction and then review every 6 weeks. And a strategic space is where you simply challenge the strategy you have made so as you can keep it on track. So when we first did this in this organization in 2017, they could immediately see alignment appearing. They reduced the time spent on operational matters when they needed to be strategic. And what was fascinating, they claimed that we saved them £500,000 within a month. So that they were switched on. And what I found as we unraveled the futures group, as we started to extend it, is that members of the leader team began to join the futures group, and that was particularly significant. What we also did in the first year is we held a TED Talk process where I delivered more or less this lecture 9 times, which in a day, which was quite difficult at the time. Okay, so let me just finish by saying that futures is challenging for sure. I usually highlight this so that people can understand. We're familiar with how we talk about the present. We can't escape that because we're alive, and so we must talk about what's going on. And we also are familiar with talking about the past, and talking about the future is quite a natural process for many people, because we all talk about what we're going to do next week, for example, or we think we can. But in organizations, doing it more formally as a part of futures, what becomes evident is that the talk is informed by the past. And so what we have to do is be critical of our talk, because we simply are taking what happened in the past, or the way we've learned to talk in the past, we bring it into the present, and then we project into the future. Now, just before I finish, and so you might take away something valuable from this session before we open up for questions, go back to the two questions that you posed right at the start of the talk. Remember, I asked you to set 2 questions with a yes or no answer. So look at each question, look at your first question, and it's for the year 2026, and say to yourself, yes, there is a yes answer to this question in 2026. You're going to project. What is the projected yes answer to that question? And don't just write yes, say the meaning of yes in relation to that question. And do that for the first question. And do it for the second question as well. So you will have 2 projected answers to the question. My usual quip here is, in 2026, let me project Arsenal will win the Premier League in 2026. That's my projection. So you can actually see we don't know really. That's why it's a projected answer. Now, you've got 2 projected answers. Now I want you to look at the projected answer for the first question and say to yourself, if this is my projected yes answer, what is my projected no answer? And you can formulate that quite easily by putting the projected answer and then say rather than. So Arsenal will win the Premier League in 2026 rather than Tottenham will win the Premier League, which is the no answer. Because if my question was, will Arsenal win the Premier League in 2026? You can see Tottenham winning the league is a no answer. Okay, so you can see, you can get a projected answer. And if you see your projected yes answer and projected no answers in relation to each other, you've got 2 possibilities, and it becomes possible to work with those in all sorts of ways to work out that all 4 answers are possible. Even the most negative answers are possible. So what does that mean for the present? And this is where you might discover saving your business. I don't know. That's what someone claimed. Okay, finally then, let me just finish to remind you that our Futures Research Group, which you can find on the website, go there. We've covered it, curriculum development. We covered individual group research, because that's another thing that we do with academics. And we do some grants and project work. I'm doing some project work, for example, with Humberside Police at the moment, and they have a futures group. And then we do some consultants. You'll find them there, but if you want any more information, you can come and find us. Okay, I'm prepared to close that down and stop the share. Let me just end the show. And hopefully we will come back to the present. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jeff. You've given us an awful lot to think about there, both in terms of futures and what they are and the impact they have, and also in terms of the process, you know, how we might get there from the organization's point of view. Andy Cow has put up a very interesting question. Can you say more about the level of seniority within the business that you aim to include in your projects? Is it board, senior management, and so on? And I just wonder if I can broaden Andy's question a little bit by asking you to say more about specific Foresight labs.
Yes.
Because it strikes me that in those labs, you have a great way of involving more people from your organization
Yes.
in the building of the strategy. But can you address Andy's question and say
Let's take the first one first, and then we'll talk about the strategic Foresight Lab idea as well. Yeah. The first point I would raise, and certainly when I started on this approach, is that I knew that they would be pretty skeptical of anything that doesn't say, look, I'm saying this isn't about prediction, this is about possibilities. So the way I approached it, and I was using the insight from my PhD students' paper, is that I needed to attract people, and we needed to show the evidence to senior managers that this was value adding. So what was really interesting in that journey, I found that by working with someone who was interested, who was my insider, a champion to interest others, we then could get futures moving in the organization. That then, when it showed evidence of value adding, would attract senior leaders to become interested. Now, I've moved on, and I'm able to tell stories now like this. So, for example, if I take my firm of architects, I was actually approached by the managing partner. The managing partner approached me, and he asked me to run a futures process with his staff. But crucially, what we have is a crucial linkage between him and his leadership team, his second in command, who is part of the futures group, and other people from the organization who are now part of the learning group. The learning group tends to be people who are up for it. In the police force, for example, I asked the deputy chief constable to find me 6 or 7 people who he thought would really be up for this and really be interested in this. And I must say, they're producing some amazing stuff about the future of policing in Humberside, for example. So in terms of seeing, but crucially, yes, it has to land. The findings from the future group has to land with the leadership team. And therefore, I would say it being not particularly value adding if the leadership team did not acknowledge and make use of the findings. So I need to, nowadays, I try and set up that pathway to ensure it happens. Coming back to the lab approach, which I aim specifically at leaders. Yes, you're right, because the way we run the lab is we make it multi-voiced. So the leadership team initiates the lab, and you can involve either in the lab itself. Now, remember, this is virtual these days rather than in a room that is physical, but in due course, maybe we'll move to a physical room. But what happens now is we set question, we examine the past, we examine the story of the organization as a first step. And of course, if you make it multi-voiced, the number of people you involve will give you different versions of what's happened in the past. So through that process, there's a way by which the findings from that process are used to consider the present circumstances. So it works in 3 phases. Look at the past, see how the past is informing the present, see what you keep, see what you don't want to keep, and then you can project forward into the future. So crucially, yes, the lab, while it is specifically for leaders to take responsibility for running it, can be rather multi-voiced. And the way I've run events like this, I've used processes called future search, which is another method, and I've used open space. One of the ways last year we ran a year-long project looking at the future of packaging at the university, and that report is available from the Retail Institute at Leeds Beckett University. So this was with 25 organizations who actually came to Leeds, and we didn't stop working until the pandemic arrived.
Thanks. There's a question, and I previously had some thoughts about the links between what you've been sharing with us tonight and risk management.
Yes.
And also previous events which this company has organized, there's been discussion of risk management and how to go about it and so on. What do you see as being the most fertile relationship between, let's call them the risk team,
yeah,
or risk management, and the process that you're advocating?
Okay. It comes basically through an explicit attention to surprises, or it comes through the first phase when, if you projected no answers, for example, and they were undesirable in the questions that you posed at the start of this exercise, well, the undesirable projections are still possibilities. So clearly you don't want to end up with the negative projection if it was undesirable. It raises the question, well, what are you going to do about it? What actions do you need to set in motion if you do not want the organization to move in response to a projection which is negative? So you can do it quite early and it comes out. So one of the interesting features of what we do is by looking at, let's say, mini scenarios for the year 2026, which are particularly negative and perverse, is we use a process called reverse extrapolation. We come backwards to the present and to say, do we want this? Do we want this to happen? What we're going to do to stop this? And so on. So the risk management process is set in motion quite early on. But you can then be more explicit about the risk management process by considering surprise futures and provocative futures, which may be positive or negative, and undesirable futures. So each is a different process and can use a range of techniques, but each of them can produce findings that can feed into a risk management strategy, for example.
You mentioned reviewing plans every 6 weeks.
Yeah.
How do you do that without the people involved getting stale?
I'm rather provocative.
Right.
So for example, I have a review tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock with a group of, a very interesting group in Sheffield. We will do it on Zoom. We've been working for 2 years together. This organization is a professional firm that practices insolvency. They are insolvency practitioners. They have had a quiet time actually until recently. So what's interesting about them though, they have not gone out. They thought they might go under at the start of this, but actually using strategic work and futures work, their two second in commands are doing a futures process with me. They have broken even they were pleased that they broke even during the pandemic year. So each time we meet, I put them through a process to challenge assumptions, to look clearly at what is not working strategically, which part of strategy needs to be relegated or even dispensed with, and so on. So I think one of the most interesting things, I've never seen myself as a consultant. I see myself as an academic first and foremost. But I've worked for 30 years with businesses. So what I've always done is use my academic credentials and my academic approach to do often what consultants do not do. And I think that's been fascinating to experience. With larger organizations, I need others to work with. I can't challenge the executive board, for example, on my own. So we need that. I highlighted what I called the strategic thinker. So that person becomes my collaborator. So in many organizations which are large, I find a collaborator who basically works with me, and then we design processes to make to challenge the leadership team.
Altering the lens a little bit and looking at how organizations fit with their environment. Has any work been done with futures in relation to climate change, or indeed any of the other UN Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, the EU has done an enormous amount on this, and so has parts of government. So interestingly, 2 weeks ago, I was just surfing around and I found a whole range of documents that are available online from the EU, which were looking at these sorts of issues. So Shell, as an organization, have a range of scenarios on their website. They have a scenarios website, and you will find documents to download. And at the government level, at the macro level, climate change, ecology, environmentalism, and so on have often been key features, the focus for futures work. So it wouldn't surprise you. Now, whether that happens at the organization level is interesting, but it's beginning to happen. One of my SMEs, an engineering SME, now includes ecology within its strategy. They would never have thought of that even 6 months ago. So what I'm beginning to see is recognition of the need to do this. But as I say, there's a great deal of literature and documentation available from the EU that is still available in English, fortunately, and also from organizations like Shell on its website.
I want to change the way we do things just a little bit going forward, because there's a number of interesting questions, and it might be better if we started a little more conversation. So I wonder, Sheila Lumsden, if we might unmute your microphone, or you might do it. And if you would like to put your question, which I think might provoke some discussion about how junior people might be involved more in the organization. Sheila.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Jeff, and indeed, Nick. That's been really interesting listening to all of that, and just so much reflecting in my head. But I guess one of the things, it was when you were talking there, Jeff, about past talk, present talk, future talk. And of course, very often in organizations, and I think it probably tends to be certainly with my own organization, that if you were to pull a group together, it will tend to be those who are senior managers and therefore have that past experience and that past knowledge. And I guess my question was actually, is there benefit in bringing in a much more diverse, either in bringing in a much more diverse voice into that group, and actually some of the very kind of absolutely next generation and those who have very little experience of the organization and do not have that past experience to actually be more innovative? And would they be more innovative in terms of the future? Or indeed, have you ever done any work in terms of actually working with two groups one which is more with the senior managers who have the past experience, one which is a younger group who have not so much of the past experience, but have a lot of knowledge of today, perhaps in other environments, and to see the differences that may arise from both. It'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
One of the key things I have always worked on is unless I'm trusted, people aren't going to bother with me. And so I tend to find initially the people who I know pretty well and trust me to challenge it in a particular way, that they know that I'm not going to do ill for them. I'm going to be benevolent. I have their interests. I want them to succeed as businesses and organizations. I want them to improve. That doesn't mean I can't be critical. Now, your second point about running two groups is interesting. I can't claim to have done that yet. So that you've raised an interesting possibility. Targeting an organization, it depends on what organization we're dealing with. Larger organizations have plenty of scope to use more, I won't say the more junior, but junior relative to the senior leadership team, usually 1 or 2 levels below them. That's probably my target area, but always with a pathway back to the leadership team. So they need sponsorship and acknowledgement that results will come through. I have enough confidence in the process now to know that that's the way to do it. Working with, and so with my insolvency business in Sheffield, it is the second level down, for example. They're the owners of the business, and then there are 2 managers who they see as being potentially moving up to their level within the next 2 or 3 years. So it becomes, I kind of think it's a great talent development mechanism, and it pushes them to move away from being operational in their orientation to be more strategic in their orientation. Now, as I say, the 9 people in my architects group remarkably, very quickly latched on to, none of them are in the partnership, none of them are partners, but they quickly latched on to how strategic they were becoming in their thinking, because by necessity, they were being abstract rather than operational, but they could see the link to what they were doing and what they were experiencing with their customers and clients almost instantly. And we've had 2 meetings so far, but already the value has been added. So for me, I can't, yeah, would I do this cold with a senior leadership team? My answer would be not unless they really trusted me, and I could find evidence of that. I probably would say, no, find someone else who I can work with, and let's build up a decent relationship in order to do that. I don't know what Nick thinks, because Nick, you've worked with all sorts of boards of directors, so you need people who, I've worked with senior leadership teams, and I always know they divide into those who are up for it, those who are not up for it, and those who are in the middle. And what you're trying to do is pull people towards you in order to score.
I think you're right. I think one of the things is you need to find suitable champions.
Yeah.
And it's really, to me, it does 2 things. One, it creates an awareness that people can be champions, but it also helps to develop the champion as well. But the good thing for the board is to make sure that they sponsor and support these people so that they can move through the organization, so that you've got young champions creating the tension in the organization, but you've also got individuals who listen to them and help them and guide them in some sort of direction. So it's 2-dimensional, I feel, to a certain extent. But just reinforcing what Jeff said, a lot of this is to do with organizational learning as well. So there's not just the fact of futures, but it's what it's doing to the people and changing their mindsets to how they see the world at the lower echelons. So you're growing capability, not just for today, but for a human talent pool in the future as well.
I want to broaden the scope just a little bit. We've got a couple of members with us who work in other countries, Hong Kong and Middle East. And I wonder if Rob Ford, you could unmute, because we have a situation in the Arab world in particular where they have their sort of Vision 2030 and so on, all beautifully articulated in 200-gram paper and so on. But of course, between now and between that are things like COVID and the other things you've been talking about. Rob, would you like to put your question?
Thank you, David. Yes, Jeff, I had a question. As David rightly said, Middle East is very interesting and developing in regards to the way they look at strategy. And much of their focus is more on some of the older proven ways of strategy. How does your futures program, how could it influence organizations that are either corporations or quasi-government or potentially government organizations to look at strategy and then tie it to both the culture and then also the implementation of the actual strategy?
Fascinating question. Let me start by saying I know parts of the Middle East very well. I've worked principally in Oman, with the airline authority, with what's called PACA, and then I worked with a project management organization, but all owned by the government, all owned by the state. What do I find? Well, incredibly deferential and hierarchical in their approach. But actually, what I've also found is that the chief exec, for example, let's say the chief exec of PACA, well, to my great relief, British educated. So while due deference was due to him, they called him, of course, His Excellency in their relationship with so I ran a leadership program for the Civil Aviation Authority called PACA in Muscat, and what I found was the importance of deference and the importance of recognition, but in fact the willingness of the chief exec to embrace it and to be receptive to what he heard in the process. Now, in that leadership program, we introduced futures to them. This was seen as important because it was a break with their tradition. So, and again, many of the participants in the leadership program were themselves had British education. There were several who'd got their PhDs in the UK, for example, so that they could see, and they were part of a sector which had to be less traditional than it might have been in the past. So my guess is, and given that I've had limited experience, but I've also done quite a lot of work in Abu Dhabi and Dubai as well over the years, introducing these sorts of ideas. What I found, of course, is there is the tradition, but of course, I'm talking about countries which have been deliberately looking outwards as well and looking to the future and developing these ideas. So we do have in Oman, we have a branch of the Futures Research Group there. So you'll find a website there that's been developed to collaborate with us on futures. But I'm training people in Muscat to deliver futures learning as we do in the UK.
Well, with apologies to everybody else who has questions, but we've not had time to get round to them. I'd like to finish with one last question, and if Hilary Lindsay might unmute herself. Hilary asks a question about VUCA, which of course stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity.
Yes.
And I think that would be a great last question to leave this session on. So Hilary, would you like to put your question?
Thank you very much, David. And Jeff, thank you so much for your presentation. I hadn't come across VUCA before, but I looked it up and saw
Yeah.
what the words were.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, of those 4 elements, which do you think is the most challenging at the present time? And what ought we to do because of that?
Yeah. Well, I would not say which of the words is the most challenging, because they're all in their own way challenging. Clearly there's uncertainty, and depends how you answered the first exercise. What's your planning horizon? Well, you don't know. I mean, at the moment, many organizations cannot say what their planning horizon is. So there's a great deal of uncertainty. Now, that ought to be answered by strategic thinking. And as we emerge from the pandemic, maybe the uncertainty is reduced, because you could then have a degree of certainty about the direction you're going in. But the volatility won't disappear. The volatility is with us, I'm afraid, for a lot longer, pandemic or not. So volatility is the key word. Complexity. We're not particularly good. We're not particularly good on complexity in this country. I can't generalize too much on that, because some people are clearly ability to argue in a complex way there. So I think that's a more long-term attribute that we need to engender. I think volatility is the one that businesses will need once they've embraced uncertainty. Ambiguity, well, would you believe this morning I did a workshop on that very matter with Humberside Police, on why diversity and inclusion are not the same thing, and why that is an ambiguous notion to think that they are. So one needs to learn tools to think in an ambiguous way, because they've been with us as long as humankind has been with us. So so each of those words is important in their own way. So I can't say which is more prominent, but perhaps uncertainty initially, followed by volatility, but complexity and ambiguity, well, forevermore.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, for those who wish to stay online for a little while, there will be an opportunity to chat informally. But to bring our formal proceedings to a close, I don't know what was in Nick's mind, but when I sat in his office and we were discussing what a relevant partnership between the company and Leeds Beckett might look like, and in addition to the company giving prizes and hosting lunches and things like that, we wanted it to be two-way. We wanted to know what research was going on. We wanted to know those things that would be relevant to liverymen and to our apprentices and our mentees. And I think we could have wanted no better start to that than what we've enjoyed tonight. Jeff, you have brought to us generously from your research and your experience in a way which has certainly resonated with my experience in organisation. And we thank you very much indeed for that. By way of an unintended benefit, let us all please be sure to buy Jeff's book when it comes out in the autumn. And if you send the publication details to the clerk, I'm sure he will include them in the delivery notices. Could I also thank Nick for his role in putting this together? Can I thank Keith and Karen for all that they have done within the company to promote and to enable this to happen. This recording will be available if you want to revisit any of it. And also, Jeff has kindly let us have a copy of his notes, which can be passed to any of you who want to take this further. But Jeff, thank you so much. I think you have started this collaboration off in a brilliant way, and we appreciate that. And as best we can on Zoom, can we give you a round of applause?
Right. silent clapping. There's something in that.
And if anybody wants to, they're welcome to unmute and stay on for some informal conversation. Otherwise, may I wish you all a safe journey home.
Thank you.